Welcome back to Birds with Words. I'm Sean Fitzgerald, your host. I'm the author of Sinners Past and A Bold to Extinction. Today, I have a lovely guest author with us to discuss horror and science fiction. Carrie, would you like to introduce yourself and where the audience can find you?
Sure. My name is Carrie Allen, and I write as O.A. Allen. And you can find me on peevishpenman.com. And across social media, everything I have is also labeled Peevish Penman, so pretty easy to find. But I'm the author of Isham Underground. I wrote dystopian sci-fi for my first book, and I've done a series, a science fiction series called Delcath, and I have my recent one is Children of Delcath. Waiting on Delcath. I also do coloring books, and like I did a reptilian coloring book. If you can see the pages, it's I've got some interesting little images in there. That was a very fun project, by the way. And I also did an anthology called the Writer's Secret Society, which you can download for free on my website, Peevish Penman. And that's my writing journey for the past 10, 15 years.
That's quite a journey. I didn't realize that the artwork was actually something you had personally done, because I've seen your website before. So that's phenomenal. So I pitched this to you as, hey, let's discuss the intersection between horror and sci-fi, because they obviously have become more ingrained. And when I was looking into this, I find it very interesting that what people consider the first sci-fi novel is now more remembered as a horror novel. But we'll get into that in just a minute. So
we're talking about Frankenstein, right?
Yes, we are talking about the original. Absolutely.
All right. Good.
What I want to first ask you is, what is sci-fi to you?
For me, science fiction is that it's an abstraction from our experience that we're having right now. So you can talk about the past and imagine how it used to be, and you can project onto the future how it might become, or you can just exist in the world of ideas, which would be another realm of abstraction. But for me, science fiction is what we project our future to be based on, like, technological evolution or de-evolution, and either one could be true. But what it's not is it's not something that flows directly from scientific truths. It comes from completely speculation about what science could be. And if you get into like quantum physics, it can get wild, and it can you can blur the edges between like supernatural and just technology. So
that's actually what I was going to ask you, is there a line between what makes science fiction and just fantasy in space?
There shouldn't be, in my opinion, but I do think I'm actually in the minority on that one. When people think of science, they're thinking about empirical evidence. It has to be observable, it has to be measurable, and it has to be, factual. And that's great if philosophically you believe that the material world is all there is, and that our minds are just like floating around untethered within the material world. If you take a different perspective and you consider that it's possible that there's different dimensions and that we are having a mental experience, kind of like a worm going through the dirt, it's like it never sees Mount Everest and it never experiences most of the world. If we are like a small entity that only sees a tiny bit of the truth, and time is relative to us, but it's not fundamental to the universe itself, then you can take science fiction and move it into territory that normally you would think of as supernatural, because the definition would be It's like, this is tangible and, you can experience it, versus this is potentially true on a quantum level. We're certain that it's possible that, plasmoid entities are, interfering with our dimensional space. And that's speculative. And that's also what I like, to be honest, is the what they call idealism. And there's a lot of foundation for it in science, but most people aren't aware of that. Most people like to stick to aliens come from other planets, not other dimensions.
Yeah. And, I think that it's ultimately up to the individual. I have my own impression of it. For example, I'll say, getting ahead of myself, I had quite a few English teachers that would have a huge problem with what you just said, but I'm not. So don't worry, no problem with me. I always use the dividing line is, for me, as a cultural side, like Star Wars to me is fantasy, but its inspiration that it drew from was Dune, and I consider Dune to be science fiction. And they both share many of the same similarities and qualities. But I think that what to me made the two difference is, and this is probably where literature is going to start saying, yeah, that's what sci-fi is that Dune was trying to make a statement, and Star Wars was more trying to just tell a fantastic story. People can probably leave comments and tell me how terrible of an impression of that is.
I think what most people who are really into writing science fiction might say is that you identified a line between what's considered like hard science fiction and what's soft science fiction. Now, the hard science fiction is going to try to be as, extrapolate from what we know as well as it can, and to be honest to like the laws of physics and everything we're completely aware of right now or suspect. Whereas like the soft science fiction is going to focus more on like the cultural phenomena, a reaction to, you put like a fantasy element in it, but you project out what might exist if this level of technology, which isn't distinguishable from, a fantasy element really. And I'd say that's, it's like it's more for social commentary. It's more for atmosphere. It's more, it's good, like space operas make, great soft science fiction, but they're not trying to predict the truth of our next developments, scientifically.
Absolutely. And, a lot of what you're touching on is like the unknown, trying to predict the unknown. And I think that's where horror starts to intersect with it. So we mentioned earlier, kind of foreshadowed this, that the original science fiction novel Frankenstein today is remembered more as a horror story. And maybe that's a little bit because Hollywood put its own interpretation to it through various different medias. But what do you think made people say, hey, there's a division between science fiction and horror? And then, I'd say about 30, 40 years later, they re-intertwined,
right.
And became one and the same again for quite a long time.
Well, I thought about that one when I was, trying to, one of my first thoughts was, okay, the beginning of science fiction, Frankenstein, it is a mad scientist, reanimating, body parts. And it's like, okay, so that's like, it's like you've got the psychological horror aspects and the body horror aspects and all that kind of stuff. But at the time it was considered to be, something that might be real and that we were afraid of it. So rather than an intellectual idea, it was, or just an intellectual idea, the emotional part is what still resonates with people. It's like we're still experiencing the narrative and in that sort of like, the horror aspects of it, the body and whatnot. Whereas the intellectual possibility of just reassembling a body with different parts, it's like, well, we do organ transplants. We are doing that already. So it doesn't have the intellectual curiosity, it doesn't inspire the intellectual curiosity that it did in the 1800s, when it was first written. So I would say that the value of the story is still, psychological, and it's more like emotional in the way you experience it, but it's not. But we no longer believe that we can get dead people, chop off an arm, and just redo the whole thing, and then it'll turn into some kind of living monster, and that the brain won't be reanimated with the person's personality and stuff like that. We have too much evidence that Frankenstein just isn't possible, not the way that she wrote it.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because I think if you look at the entirety of the original story, so not the Hollywood interpretation of it, mm-hmm. that there is a much deeper story, because it's not just about with the way Hollywood pitched it, which is you created a zombie or a monster, and then the villagers show up and burn down. That's not at all how it goes. There's a chase around part of the world where Frankenstein's monster hunts down Frankenstein's family. And that is the bulk of, I'd say, 2/3 of the story, which is interesting because now we're in a world where AI is creating creatures or potential creatures that are separate from humanity. And then we have companies that are creating artificial brains out of matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that her story still resonates, which is, going back to
it does.
I'll let you say your portion of
it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it does. I think what you're saying is it's absolutely, all the elements of the story are real. But when we go to science fiction, we want to take the idea of the little cells of the brain that then develop the little black eyes and stuff, and we want to talk about that and project out things that we don't know. I think science fiction has to project into the future. It has to it can't be just this is getting harder than it should be. But I think that a lot of the scientific questions were solved from Frankenstein, but this, you can rewrite the same story and update it and say, what about this? What about this? These unknowns. And then you could tell the same story again, just with a slight tweak of the technology. And then the whole story is just as valid as it ever was, because of the human experience of the unknown and our nature. We have this drive towards existential dread. We don't really know what we are, Yeah. We don't know what our consciousness is. We don't know what our dreams are. We can't define our real lived experience, Yeah, and we don't like to talk about that in science, though.
Well, I think science fiction, to me, what kind of makes science fiction separate from what we talked about earlier, fantasy, is science fiction at some level is giving a warning of our future. Hey, if you don't check and balance, morality with science, these are potential problems. We see that with iRobot. I'm talking about the novel, not the movie, obviously. Frankenstein obviously hits on it. And I think that's why horror and science fiction intertwines so well. They've always kind of been married at the hip.
Yeah.
If we see any major science fiction novel, there's always that kind of either a fear of the unknown, a fear of our own failures, or some type of fear that's ingrained in there. Even if it's not necessarily sci-fi horror, there's that horror element to it.
Yeah, I think one of the things in science fiction that a couple of the things that lend themselves to a horror aspect in science fiction is we haven't defined humanity's place in the universe, and that massive unknown gives us a sense of dread. And it's you're playing on that, it makes for an engaging narrative, so it's the horror aspects in science fiction are sometimes some of the best parts, And another one is like the ethics, so we've always got that mad scientist who's just teetering on the edge, and he's completely divorced himself from, his obligation to society, his subjects are being basically tortured, and he doesn't care because it's for the greater good of science, And there's a lot of like, you can get to the evil of humanity when you take a strictly scientific view of things, right? It's like there's no humanity in just observation, And I would say, like, the other part of science fiction that really lends itself to horror, probably more than others, is we don't understand our own intelligence and what it means. It's just like we don't know why we dream. We don't know where our consciousness is located. It's like, it's just that massive metaphysical problem of, what this world is just hangs over us, and science has not done any good at answering it at all. It just avoids it, says don't talk about it. And with horror, you can start to poke at that, that question. It's like, why are we here? What are we? And in science, you're supposed to know the answer. It's like we're just a bunch of atoms. Right. That's it.
It's funny that you say all that, because I like to go down weird tunnels of research, because I think every writer has to. And I found that doctors and scientists cannot tell you why we need to sleep. They can tell you the effect of us not sleeping. They can tell you all the negatives to it. They can tell you what it does for us, but they can't tell you why we actually need it. They just know you have to get some amount of sleep sometime in your life, otherwise bad things happen. Can't explain that. And I think that you're dancing around the same concepts that I do when I discuss. There has to be some type of question or morality check that science fiction provides. Right. And the next question then for you would be, at what point does science fiction become sci-fi horror? Because, I would say that almost every sci-fi medium has an element of horror in it, even if it's not focused on it. There's an element to it. But obviously you can't list everything as horror, because otherwise horror would just be a giant genre of sci-fi novels. So what's that line to you?
I would say the emotional impact. Like, one of the things that I found myself doing, like when I started my first Delcath book, I put my characters, it's very short. I put my characters on an asteroid, and they've gotten disconnected from their society, and they're mining, but they're lost in space basically, and they're running out of water, and it's just like, it's all the dread and the fear and the psychological unraveling of being alone with your two closest friends, and just like not being able to manage in that situation. So why is it science fiction? Because they're asteroid miners. But, why is it horror? Well, because of that emotional impact. Whereas, like, I can write a story in science fiction where it's just all intellectual curiosity, and it's just like, interesting, it's great, but it doesn't like try to inspire any questions. It doesn't show you the unknown. It just it's like, oh, isn't that neat? That's kind of cute. It doesn't say like, but what does this mean? What does it mean for us? AI, where is it going? How long do we have before that takes over? My favorite unknown right now, I have to mention it, is have you been watching the New Jersey drones stuff on TV? Yeah. I think that's a perfect example of like both horror and like science fiction potential, because there's a lot of people who believe that they're plasmoid entities that have always been around, and that that the government knows about, but that are like a different type of intelligence than we are. and that they are just floating around, and that there's drones up there too, and airplanes and everything else, but the attention is there because of these plasmoids. And then, people have the dread of like the government isn't telling us the truth, and the suppression of information, and it's just like, and then the other part of the dread is like, well, it's like, is it from Iran? Do they have a mothership, and are they launching these drones at us right now? Is it just government, but not like is it just a technology that's beyond us, or is it a form of intelligence that's beyond us? It's like, these are great unknowns. And where does everybody head? It's like immediately towards like fear, because we don't know. And it's like, the more you think about it, the more like terrifying it is to be that vulnerable by what you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a favorite for me.
We could go all day about international politics and its impact on us. Let me ask, so your story about the miners, do you pitch it as a sci-fi story only, or do you pitch it as sci-fi horror?
I never used the term horror because I never thought of myself as somebody who had anything to do with horror. Like I've never watched horror movies. I never read horror stories. I thought that I didn't even like suspense. Like it's like it affects me too much. I'm like, oh my God, what are they doing? Why would they do this? What's the point of this? And I just like run out of the room, and I won't even watch it, So I never thought of myself as interested in it at all. And then the more that I was like, okay, you know what? I need to broaden my horizons. And, I watched some films that were sci-fi, but they had some stronger, horror elements. And I started to realize that it's like, there's a lot more to horror than I realized. It's like there's more types of horror. Like the psychological horror is it's just like it's going for that, like that emotional impact, and like the fragility of the human mind, and the dark side of human nature. And then as I started to recognize that in other people's work, it's like, well, how could I have written a book without those kinds of elements? And it made me think, it's like, well, I should be reading more of that to make my sci-fi better. Because if I focus entirely on the intellectual without having emotional impact, the pacing gets so bad. And the reason for the story becomes kind of like, airy-fairy, it's the weakness. And so I started looking at horror because it's like, that was what I was missing. It's like that balance of like the emotional impact. And I noticed like when I was I got stuck on a TikTok once where I accidentally joined the guy's feed and he's reading his horror novel. And I'm like, the way that he just could ride my emotions in waves, and it's like I was comfortable, then I was deeply uncomfortable, and then I was okay again, and then he was taking it down to somewhere dark. I was like, you know what, that's actually really fun. Why was I avoiding that? It's like I just loved it. So I feel like that we make these distinctions between the genres, but I doubt that any genre is good without having a strong awareness of the others. That's my belief.
I think ultimately what that comes down to is you have to care about your characters, right? And horror fear is something that we all universally feel. You felt it at some point if you've been on this planet for any amount of time. And easy to connect to. I read, I can't remember who said this. I'm sorry if you're listening. They said that you can have a great world built in any type of story, fantasy or sci-fi, but if nobody cares about your characters, nobody's going to care about the story.
Right. And I think that that's my weakness as a writer, or at least it has been before I started questioning. It's like, well, how do you make people care about your characters? And I feel like horror starts with the caring about the characters, and then like once you've walked somebody into their perspective, then the author is able to like lead you along that narrative. And with sci-fi, you usually start with world building first, and then it's just like the characters are often an afterthought. And a lot of sci-fi is horrible because it's just like, because you don't care about those characters. It's like, in fact, they're really actually quite annoying. And at one point, I started writing characters deliberately annoying just because I wanted them to have some kind of like reaction from the reader, because it's like I didn't want empty characters, so I thought I'd just make them like really irritating characters. But that's one of the things I admire in the horror author is their ability to like the character focus and the character, like I suspect you get that first, like that that really is an element that you that everything turns on whether or not you've made your character something that a person can identify with or relate to.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I completely understand where you're coming from on when writing sci-fi, we sometimes forget about I'm not going to say all of our characters because it's not right. We always have a main character or antagonist, protagonist, anti-hero, whatever you want to call them. But I saw that when I was writing A Fold to Extinction. There was one comment where somebody said, hey, the main characters are great, but all the other characters kind of fade into the background. And I took exception to that just because, in my mind, all the characters had their place. So when I wrote Sinner's Past, which is not sci-fi, purely horror,
right.
I made every single character very specific with their own background, and I gave them their own point of views from everything, solely so I could prove to myself that I'm able to do that with my characters. And I hope I carry that forward if I ever return back to writing sci-fi, which I plan to eventually, just no time in the near future.
Right. Fair enough.
So at what point do you say that a story is sci-fi / horror versus it's a horror / sci-fi? Does that make sense?
Well, I do have an answer to that. I got my master's in information studies, right? I was a librarian for about 15 years. And the truth about genres is that they help people find your book. They give the people distributing, like either through a library or a bookstore, a place to locate your book. And it's not a truth about what's inside. Most books, when you go to like decide which section it goes into, is going to have a combination of different elements. But I would say it's like, what's the strength of your story and how do you want people to find it? And like, you could like run it through like a AI and have it analyze, and it's like it's 30%, existential dread and like 20% intellectual intrigue, and it's like, but that's not going to give you the reader's like reason for picking it up. So I would say personally, I think this is a truth about the relationship between the reader and the writer. It's like, put it where the people who are most likely to want it, to be attracted to it, to enjoy it, where they're most likely to look. That's the truth. And you can have a story that's like densely heavy in sci-fi, but if it's got that horror element that the horror readers would just be like, ooh, that's intriguing, I'd just say go ahead and put it in horror. And if it's like, if you've got a horror story that has like something that's kind of like cutting edge, very uncertain territory in science where there's a lot of debate, and that's where people are motivated to say, well, let's see what this person says about this. The science fiction, because they're the ones who care the most about that.
Yeah, I was going to say my biggest argument has always been I felt like Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, the novel, not the movie, was pitched incorrectly in the genre department because I've never seen it as a thriller, which it's considered a techno thriller. That's what Michael Crichton is known for.
Okay.
But I've always read it more as a science fiction horror. And if you go through it, it's a visceral animal nightmare when it comes down to the elements, because you have a character that's essentially Michael Crichton, who was a heart surgeon,
right,
giving exposition through one particular character and questioning the morality of the science that's pitched in the story. But then the rest of it is a terrifying chase of characters trying to survive these
right
monsters. And I've always
yeah. Well, I think that it's also because of like the subgenres. Like, I mean, I was reading up on science fiction before, being able to talk to you, or not about science fiction. I was reading up on horror before being able to talk to you. And I never knew that like slasher horror was a subgenre. But, it's like the first thing I thought of was like Fear of the Walking Dead. It's like they're all like trying to survive the zombies, and it's like there's a little bit of science in there that makes it all be like, oh, okay, maybe. But the whole thing is just like, just survive, the drive to survive, and the enemy, coming in, and, it's like, never quite catching you, but getting really close. And yeah, it's, I would say that you're probably right about Jurassic Park, because it's like, why are we watching it? It's not because we're terrified of genetic engineering and dinosaurs. It's like we know that's off in the distance, and we've been thinking about it for a long time. It's not intellectually intriguing, not exactly, But as far as like the survival aspect, once it does emerge, that's intense. That's the big unknown. It's like, could we handle it? It's not could it exist? It's would we survive? And the zombie thing, it's like, you get you get a pandemic and it turns people into zombies. It's like, okay, there's some basis for it. They have that fungus in like ants that can turn them into little zombie ants. And then we have pandemics, and it's like, put the two together. It's not too hard to conceive of. But how would we cope, as people? But the survival question is the good part. That's the fun part. What are we going to use for weapons? What are we going to eat? It's like, how are we going to feel? How are we going to manage those emotions? It's like, what if it's right around the corner? It's like, what if there's 20 around the corner? What if you can't depend on your best friend? It's like
all valid questions.
Those are the real questions.
Yeah, and that's what makes fun, like writing and reading both sci-fi and horror so entertaining. And it's interesting because I said that I would put Jurassic Park as sci-fi / horror. On the flip side, Dan O'Brien's script and novel, and then ultimately the movie version of Alien, I actually put that as horror / sci-fi, even though like it doesn't really work in the original setting. If you take away and say it's just a horror movie, it doesn't work. But I still say that it has to be horror because the entire.
And we're talking about Alien?
Yes, Alien. I'm sorry.
Okay. I have to confess, I was so afraid of horror, not just like mildly afraid of horror, that I've never watched Alien or Predator.
Yeah,
And I'm ashamed. I am very ashamed. But they just get to me so much. What I mean?
Yes, I'm okay. Personally, I'm very hurt that you haven't seen those, but I
will now. I've been called out. I will now.
But look, you have to do, when it comes to the Alien franchise, you have to do the first two, which are, it's funny because they're completely different genres. Like the first one's horror / sci-fi, and the second one's action / sci-fi, which is
okay.
Okay. I'm not going to give my impression of Predator just because it's a little bit further down a rabbit hole, but Alien is essentially just a haunted house in space. That's
okay.
Down to. But it has enough of the sci-fi side of it. And I know there's an English teacher I had out there that absolutely hates my impression of this because he said that it's not sci-fi because he had a very strict definition of what science fiction is. I said, no, it is, because it you're dealing with a corrupt corporation. You're dealing with science that isn't completely implausible from what we understand about our basic rules.
Right.
So it has those elements, and then it has a horror element. So he was hard set that it was a fantasy story.
But let me ask, Sean, let me ask you something, if you don't mind me turning it on you. This English teacher of yours, this person had an impression on you.
Oh, 100%. I had him for 3 years.
Okay. Yeah.
So I took AP English 3 out of my 4 years in high school. And I will say that he gave me a great impression of literature. I wouldn't have read some of the big classics had it not been for him. But I also had a couple, like earlier I said, I had a few other impressions. Those weren't the same teacher. I had a few.
Oh, okay.
I had through I took creative writing in college, and that was a great
class.
Got me into writing my own. She had her own impressions of what was and wasn't things. So I've heard this. There's a whole bunch of terms out there that I really butt heads with, and I'm going to There's a saying out there that drives me nuts called "the author is dead." I absolutely hate that saying, and I look down on anybody who takes an impression of a writing and uses that.
What is it? What is it?
It's essentially saying that you can't use what the author intended or the author has said about the writing. It's just whatever you take away from the writing. So if you've ever heard the term, the curtains are blue, which is basically saying, okay, if the author wrote the curtains are blue, the blue represents the character's inner depression and sadness in that scene. And essentially they're saying that if you take that away, that is the correct interpretation. And if the author came back and said, no, the character doesn't have depression or sadness in this moment, that is incorrect because he didn't put that into the writing. So I'm simplifying this. There's going to be somebody out there.
I remember my mother telling me that the ring in Lord of the Rings represented the bomb. And then I remember reading that it's like that. Well, he didn't intend that. So, it's like, who's right? I get the question. But, I never liked English classes. That was my least favorite, believe it or not. I was like, it's like, okay, it matters a lot to some people. I get that. Like, and like the putting labels on things is very important to certain aspects of, like words are putting labels on things. So of course they want to label aspects of literature. But it's so restrictive, isn't it? Yeah. These are the questions just, do they have to be answered?
Yeah. And I think that's what it boils down to is sometimes things are left, and we can say this as writers, sometimes things are left vague because we want the reader to fill those spaces in. And sometimes things are very intentional. Sometimes I do use colors in a very intentional way because I'm trying to do that. But sometimes the curtains are blue because I needed to put a blue color in there.
Right. And, and sometimes, it's like you just like fill some random sensory, details just so that the person's a little bit more immersed in that scene. It's just like, exactly. And it's not like telling them everything about the scene. It's just like, it's like get some smells, get some sounds, just, remind them that this is a real place and you're fully, and I use that a lot in the writing with science fiction, because it's like the drive to focus on the intellectual, it takes you out of your emotions, it takes you away from your sensory experience. It's just like, and any time that you bring it back a little bit, I think it's helpful. It gives the intellectual aspect a whole lot more impact. So,
Carrie, I love that we just went down this rabbit hole, because I was intending to do a completely separate podcast just on this.
Oh, good. Sounds like one I'd like to listen to, but go ahead.
Exactly that, because I'm going to go back to, the curtain's always blue.
Okay.
To your point, I recently was working with my editor on an upcoming series, and there was a scene where the character is looking out in the distance, and I said originally the car, there was a car out there, and that's it. I just left it at that. And my editor came back and said, hey, you need to put a little bit more details in here just to bring us into the scene. So I came back and said it was a Corolla sitting out there. And editor came back and said, put a little bit more details in there. So I said, okay, it's a blue Corolla, and I gave an angle and everything on that. And that's what we went with. But I can absolutely see somebody coming back and saying, well, that means this character is sad because you're including blue in there and all these deeper emotions. Honestly, in that point, it was just a visual. But in a different scene, where I use weather, the weather does represent something in that particular scene. So that's why I absolutely hate that literary use of the author is dead, because there are right impressions and there are wrong impressions.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's supposed to be a like communication between the author and the reader. It's like, as authors, we sit down, we know it's like the story doesn't come alive until somebody reads it and perceives it, and but you're not going to say it's like the author just doesn't matter whatsoever, because like the richness that you get from understanding their intent can, like, because if you sometimes, okay, take the story that I wrote for your blog, right? I meant it to be a story about like a girl who had died, and then all the characters she meets were people that were dead, but she's not really aware of it. And it's carbon monoxide poisoning, and I just kind of dropped a hint, but I didn't like hammer it, into clarity. And then this, this like entity that comes and consumes her at the very end was the personification of her fear. And so when she dies, she goes into this dreamlike state. She's in her home. People who have died before are coming over to visit her. And then she's eaten by a dark entity because she's so afraid, because she's starting to realize that she's dead, And if you didn't catch, and nobody did, the fact that she was dead, it changes the whole story. So why wouldn't it be relevant that I meant for you to infer that she might be dead, or that she, and by the end that in fact, yes, she was, and so was everybody else in the whole story. And it's like,
segment out, because you're gonna have to come back and read the story. I'm kidding. I won't cut it out. now you have to come back and read the stories.
Sorry. I'll write another one. I really want to write about the drones versus plasmoids, like situation with New Jersey, because it's like that's so ripe for interpretation. There's like so many different theories going on. It's like, so I'll write something else for your blog, and I won't spoil it because it's not been written yet.
There we go. No, I think you're right on the money. And it's was it your mother you said that was talking about the ring representing the bomb?
Yeah, she said that when I was I must have been like reading it for the first time in grade school, and she's like, well, what that represents? It's like the bomb. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess so. But then I read in college, it's like, no, it wasn't the bomb. It's like, but in the 60s, that was the interpretation that, everybody, accepted. And it kind of, it made sense at the time. It's like power, ultimate power. What would it be in that era? And the answer is, it's like, well, the nuclear bomb, it threw us for a loop for like 50 years, Now we look at AI and say, ooh, that's the bomb,
Well,
this incredible.
I have to ask this because it's more sci-fi and there's no horror element to it. Have you read Starship Troopers?
No, I don't think so.
So I highly encourage you to.
Okay.
And the reason why this is not a complete segue, I constantly hear that the book is a fascist book, and
oh, really?
It is not. The author often painted as a fascist. If you look into his personal life, he was a socialist, and he helped in a campaign for a socialist president in the late 50s, early 60s. But the book itself, it was tried to be lampooned by his family and by Voorhees, the director, and they made a movie about it. And the movie has absolutely nothing to do with the book, except for there's humans versus space bugs. That's all they have in common. And if you read the book, it's a much more complex book, and he develops this society where essentially you have to serve the country or serve the planet in some way to be allowed to vote. And most people go through the military service because it's the way to get your voting rights. But there's also like a civil service side where you can help build roads.
That's exactly what happens in here. It's like you have to do service in order to vote in the post-apocalyptic society. It's a fantastic concept, but go ahead.
It is. But what I think a lot of people misunderstand is he was experimenting within a society, but he was also making a point of nuclear proliferation. Oh my gosh, I can't speak today. He was making an argument we should absolutely have the atomic bomb, because at the time period, there was a large movement saying we don't need the atomic bomb. This was a terrible idea. But he was saying, well, the Soviets have it, and we don't want the Soviets to beat us with having too many bombs. So he wrote this story saying, hey, look, here's a fictional situation where the atomic bomb is the ultimate weapon that we use, because unlike the movie, the soldiers are in mechs that jump around planets and they use nuclear bombs to destroy areas of the bugs. And for whatever reason, that's always missed when people come back and they talk about Starship Troopers. They talk about the society element. And that's where I come back and say the author is not dead, because he obviously had an intention and it was a product of the time period. So that's where I was going with when your mom was like, reading stuff.
Yeah. No, I'm going to have to read that one now. That puts on my list. I've got to do Alien, the first three. First two. Okay. And then Starship Troopers. There's been some science fiction that I've avoided because I get scared so easily.
Well, I promise you, Starship Troopers, if you read the book, it's not horror whatsoever. It's more like a military book, 100% on that.
But does it one of the subgenres that I was really excited about when I was reading up on horror in order to talk with you today was cosmic horror.
Yes.
Like, so the, did you ever see Annihilation? It was a movie that came out in like 2018.
I think so. I think I saw it when it came out. I'm not.
It's like the shimmer. It's like this thing kind of like reorders reality, and so like people like turn into a bunch of flowers. Or one scene that sticks out with me is like somebody's intestines start moving like snakes and stuff like that. And it's like, they don't know what it is, but it's an alien form of life. And they're just, it's like, and it could be anything, anywhere. And, it's pretty intense, but it's like, I mean, that one, that's a good example of like cosmic horror. And, I really feel like that's where, the like sci-fi and horror, like they both have to be present to make that one function as a narrative.
I think cosmic horror is associated primarily with H.P. Lovecraft.
And
I think, the biggest problem when it comes to cosmic horror, and you can see this if you ever try to watch a movie based on one of his stories or books, is that in literature or in reading, cosmic horror is very easy. I'm not going to say easy to write, but it's easy to paint the picture because you don't have to be specific about it. So if you read a lot of his stories, the creatures aren't always detailed enough for you to actually be able to sit down and draw. People have attempted to, like the fish people. It's not explicitly said what exactly they look like or all the entities. But in the movies, you have to have something visual. So that's where we get all different weird concepts. But the horror of the unknown, which is really what cosmic horror is, translate into movies with that. And
well, that's why books still need to exist.
Yeah, I don't think. Look, there's nothing better than bringing a piece of paper and hallucinating for a couple hours.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. What's funny is that I love like taking a lot of my inspiration from Sumerian mythology. And they have fish people, it's like, but when they go to like represent things, they just use the symbols and they didn't even worry about trying to make it, like realistic. So it's like, they just have like a fish with a man's head attached to it. And it's like, it's just symbolically it's like it's a fish plus it's a man to make the fish people man type thing. And then, it's like you get like, I mean, another example that we all understand is like all the Egyptian gods that have like the beetles for heads or the monkey or whatever. It's like, it's not that they actually thought that they had a beetle for a head. It's that they were representing man plus this type of, like thought process or thought form, and so it's a symbolic representation. And so Sumerian, like relief carvings have got all these, fascinating things that we look at and go, oh, this is literal. They just, they're just wacky and they thought these crazy things. And it's like, no, they were, I think, highly abstract and just not worried about representing it. Like they're not even trying to make it materialize it for you in the visual representation. And when we write, like books in that type of genre, it's like, well, we don't need to. You don't need to visualize it. You can play with ideas and not have to like represent them in a material space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, going back culturally, there's a term for this, and forgive me, I don't know the term, but we like to look at our ancestors as dumber than they actually were.
But they're not.
Yeah. I think the worst thing we have ever done is called the Middle Ages and that area the Dark Ages.
Oh, yeah.
Now that we've learned how things had progressed afterwards, there was still science happening all through Europe, obviously all through Asia, all through the rest of the world. I run a blog on. I have another blog that just dives into all forms of alchemy because they were doing some fascinating things, and I think we lost sight of what they were trying to convey. When we went, like when empiricism, like in Europe, like took over as the intellectually dominant, philosophy, we poo-pooed everything that came before, and then we separated religion and science as rigidly as possible. And then it's like, we lost the plot. We lost the narrative intellectually, by dividing everything so rigidly. Like everything that the alchemists were doing, it's like they had, they were doing like meditative work, inner alchemy and outer alchemy. And their whole focus was on transformation, both of the self and of the environment. And most people don't even know that. They don't even know that they weren't just like sitting around writing symbols and hoping for, to summon a demon or, make gold out of lead or, simple stuff. They had some nuance and some information that we abandoned badly. Yeah. I mean,
and
it's great that you brought up the lead to gold portion of it.
Yeah.
Because when they started understanding molecules, they went back and said, hey, they might have been kind of right. And they tried it again because they understood that you couldn't share certain elements anymore. So they tried lead to gold all the way up into the early 20th century, thinking that they might be right. And we now know from our understanding of nuclear fission, they're not, but they understood at that level.
That depends on the perspective. If you're thinking you can actually turn lead into gold, but the resources that it takes is greater than the value of the gold itself. And that's a problem with the value of gold, not with the science behind it. So, it's like, but they called them puffers, the guys that were like always promising to turn, lead into gold. But they were operating with a scientific theory that, it's like that you just had to like change one thing and then each metal could become the other metal, and they're not wrong about that. It's like, how many, electrons are going around the nucleus. It's like, well, it's a different number for each element. So they had the idea. They just didn't have the microscopes we do, to define it clearly.
You can almost early version of sci-fi authors.
What's that?
I said you could almost say that they were the early version of sci-fi authors.
They really were, though. They absolutely were. That's why I find them so fascinating. And here's another way that they weren't wrong, but we poo-poo them. It's like the whole like earth, fire, water, and air. It's like these are the forms of matter. We've got earth, solid, water, liquid, air, gas, and then fire. Well, it's like a certain part of the fire is plasma, and if you consider like what they were really referring to, it's like, well, the sun is plasma. And so, it's like they had determined forms of matter and named them appropriately for the time. But scientifically, that's still a useful concept. And so if we take their understanding and we, transpose our understanding and then revisit what they're saying, they had an awareness of a lot of things that we just say, it's like, oh, but we proved it, so we only understood it after we proved it. And it's like, not really. They really had an understanding before they could prove it. And some of it was kind of useful. They have some observations in there that are pretty fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're getting right up onto the hour now, Carrie. Is there anything you want to touch on before we let our audience go?
No, I just want to, my reason for coming and doing this podcast with you is because I'm hoping that people who are exclusively dedicated to science fiction, I hope like me, they take another look at horror, because it's got so much to offer. The cross-genre like writing experience, I think is something that it's like been so beneficial to me that I think I'm going to actually go and explore some other genres and see what it is that we're losing by getting too dedicated to one form of narrative. And yeah, it's all new for me as far as like horror goes, but I'm really enjoying it like a lot. It's made writing fun again. It's made it something to explore and something to discover, and I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss that and talk to you about your experiences.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, I really appreciate your time today. I hope you join us again in the future, because, obviously you have to come back and you have to read your 2 stories now. We have to talk about all the problems I have with, like, my past trauma and literature teachers and the way they I
had trauma, too.
We've been
with English teachers.
We've been misled. It's so much more fun than they let us on to be. Well, again, thank you so much. And for everybody listening, again, I'm your host, Sean Fitzgerald with Birds with Words. I will include all the links for Carrie's information at the bottom. Until next time, stay frosty.